They were born on the same day. They were copies of each other and simultaneously wholly different people. One was a sadistic schizophrenic, the other a striving businessman. One was a promiscuous homosexual, and the other tried to be a family man. But was there really that large of a difference between them, or was it all fiction? The Kray twins were true gangsters who were on the top and lost everything because of their own stupid decisions. They had only themselves to blame for having a bad ending. Here is their genuine story. If you look for why the Kray brothers became what they were, you should look at the fact that their family was of Irish and Gypsy ancestry, a truly explosive mix. Ronald and Reginald were born on October 24th, 1933. Reggie, technically, was the older brother because he was born 10 minutes earlier. The twins were not the only children in the family. They already had a 6-year-old brother, Charles, who would later play no small part in the brothers' life of crime, and a sister, Violet, who unfortunately died in infancy. Everyone took part in raising Ronnie and Reggie except their father. Their dad was in the precious metal scrap business, selling clothes and appliances, and was constantly on the road. Even when the father was in London, where the family lived, he was more often seen drinking in pubs than at home with his family. Their maternal grandfather, Jimmy Cannonball Lee, partly replaced the father's role. It was the grandfather, who was once quite good at boxing, who got the twins addicted to the sport. Subsequently, boxing skills would become very useful for the two brothers. Interestingly enough, their grandpa was a class act. He liked to do tricks like putting his tongue on a red-hot poker, balancing on bottlenecks, and tap dancing in pubs. Their grandfather had taught them to box when they were teenagers, and they were predicted to have a bright, athletic future. But their natural talent was hindered by disgusting discipline. They had some success, however. The brothers even reached the finals of the London School Boxing Championships. Subsequently, Ronnie and Reggie fought 6 professional fights each, with Ron winning 4 and Reggie not losing a single one. As boxers, they were very different from each other. Reggie was cold-blooded, cautious, very technical, and, most importantly, always listened to advice. Ronnie was the opposite of him. He just went right for the kill until he was stopped. The difference in the boxing styles was a good demonstration of the difference in temperament. Reggie was serious and analytical, while Ronnie was impulsive and risky. Boxing was supposed to instill the necessary discipline in the brothers, but ended up being an instrument intimidation. The further the Krays grew, the harder it became to control them. Their military service, if you can call it a service, was probably the starting point for their later life as criminals. It was in the army that the brothers showed who they were as adults. The twins were drafted into the Royal Infantry in 1952. After arriving at the regiment and looking around, they realized that they didn't like it there. So the brothers decided not to stick around and headed calmly for the exit. A corporal who saw them leaving tried to stop them, but the corporal didn't expect what happened next. Ronnie punched him in the lower jaw. After this, the Kray brothers quietly returned to their East End home. It's hard to say what they were hoping would happen, but it was clear that the army would not let this kind of trickery go. So the next morning, the police came to them and tried to arrest them. Of course, the Kray brothers resisted, but they were captured and turned over to the army the following day. They were first locked up in the Tower of London and then transferred to Somerset's Shepton Mallet Military Prison for a month to await trial. They were found guilty and sent to prison in Canterbury, Kent. Perhaps the brothers were already thinking about pursuing a criminal future. Perhaps it was their youth and intemperance. But their so-called military service put an end to their future in boxing and many other possible careers. In prison, the Kray brothers had no intention of stopping. Outbursts of rage, dousing guards with excrement, setting mattresses on fire. Once, they even managed to pour a huge vat of boiling water on a guard and handcuffed another guard to the cell with his own handcuffs. And this is only a small part of their adventures in prison. They were then transferred to a regular cell block, where they attacked their guards with a vase and made their escape. However, they were quickly returned to prison and awaited transfer to the civil authorities for crimes they had managed to commit on the outside. It was madness. In the end, everyone, including the guards, feared them, for a good reason. So it's not surprising that their last night in that prison was just that. They spent their last night in Canterbury drinking cider, eating crisps, and smoking cigarillos, courtesy of the young national servicemen acting as their guards. Perhaps there was little doubt as to what the Kray brothers would end up doing. Given their behavior, temperament, and unruly disposition, a life of crime awaited them. Soon after their release, that's what they did. Borrowing money from their older brother Charlie, the Krays bought a rundown billiard club where they began their criminal enterprise. Most of the customers were lower-end criminals, and the Kray brothers didn't go into business for themselves immediately. By the late 1950s, the Krays had been working for J. Murray, an authority figure from Liverpool, for several years. They were involved in carjackings, armed robberies, and arson, and with the proceeds, they acquired other clubs and properties. That's when the brothers decided to create their own gang, which they called the Firm. There was a division of responsibilities between the brothers. Reggie was in charge of strategic development, and Ronnie was in charge of combat operations. Reggie made use of his boxing abilities in the criminal world, and he apparently developed a tried and tested method of breaking someone's jaw with a single punch. He would offer his target a cigarette, and Reggie would strike it as it neared their mouth. Their open, relaxed jaw would take the brunt of the impact, supposedly breaking every time. Ronnie, aka the Colonel, in charge of combat operations, increasingly used force without good reason. Gradually, Ronnie's behavior began to alarm his gangster buddies, but it was nothing compared to what he would do next. In the fall of 1956, Ronnie the Colonel shot his opponent in the leg during a conflict. He filed a police report against Ronnie, and Ronnie faced time in prison. But the case was soon dropped. Ronnie remained free. However, this did not pacify him. On the contrary, he became more and more troublesome. He drank heavily, abused drugs, and became morbidly suspicious. Whereas his brother Reggie tried to keep his head down and keep his criminal record low, Ron did so loudly and without a care. He seemed to get off on violence. In 1960, Ronnie Kray was imprisoned for 18 months for threats and extortion. There, his mental condition began to deteriorate dramatically, and he was sent to a psychiatric clinic for examination, where he was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic. In the 1960s, Reggie and Ronnie were considered prosperous and charming owners of many colorful establishments, including nightclubs. Much of their fame had nothing to do with criminal activity. The brothers socialized with lords, deputies, and people from the world of show business. They tried to link the best of both worlds in their clubs, gangsters and celebrities, and they were pretty good at it. Ronnie would later write in his autobiography, "They were the best years of our lives." They called them the swinging 60s. The Beatles and the Rolling Stones were rulers of pop music. Carnaby Street ruled the fashion world, and my brother and I ruled London. We were effing untouchable. In the personal life of the brothers, things were going pretty well too. Frances Shay met Reggie Kray when she was only 16. He was 10 years older. Their wedding took place in 1965 and caught everyone's attention. Only Frances' mother was not pleased by the union of her daughter and one of the Krays at all. Ostentatiously showed her contempt for the Kray brothers by wearing black attire to the wedding. She knew how this could have ended, but Frances didn't want to listen to her mother. And, as it turned out, she should have taken the advice. Frances was vivacious and seductive, not the skinny, shabby girl everyone saw on screen and legend. She was a real wild child, and yet her marriage to this charming but still criminal man was doomed. The newlyweds spent their honeymoon in Athens, and 8 months later, Frances returned home to her mother and declared her desire to leave Reggie. Family life was tumultuous, and just a week after the wedding, Frances made her first suicide attempt. Serious mental illness and several more suicide attempts would drive her to electroshock therapy. At one point, she even planned to shoot herself with a pistol that was hidden under her bed. A knife, a meat cleaver, and a sword could all be found in their bedroom. At some point, Reggie started putting a gun by the bed and keeping a switchblade knife. He often told Frances to shut up and threatened her physically. Yet there's a fair amount of writing in Frances' diaries describing Reggie as an extremely positive person. Ronnie lived close by and frequently visited them, and he was fond of walking around in nothing but his underpants. In addition, Frances suspected that Reggie was gay. But out of the two, the one who was genuinely gay was Ronnie, though he didn't like to be called that. Ronnie personally selected the waiters and waitstaff at the club, the main criterion being physical appearance. Naturally, it was nice, good-looking guys, not girls. He called himself bisexual, and incidentally, he was not ashamed of it. Especially since it was true that Ronnie loved not only men, but women as well. In the 60s, Ronnie dated a woman he wanted to marry for 3 years, but it didn't work out. Much later, Ronnie did get married, 2 times. He identified with the 19th century English general Charles George Gordon. Gordon was like me, homosexual, and he met his death like a man. I hope I do the same when it's time for me to go. It was also a red flag for the police because homosexuality was illegal in England in the 1960s. Frances, who was now part of the Kray family, was forced to live with them, but it didn't last long. Reggie and Frances' marriage ended after only 2 years. The official version of the investigation remains that Frances Shea committed suicide. However, there's another interesting but rather dubious version. In 2002, a former cellmate and supposed lover of Reggie Kray stated that it was Ronnie who killed Frances. He was jealous for his brother and made Frances swallow pills. This was revealed to a cellmate by Reggie Kray himself. Before committing suicide, Frances left a note saying that she wanted her maiden name, Shea, stamped on her tombstone. She no longer wanted to be associated with the Kray family. Reggie was against it and made every effort to have her buried under his last name, the Kray family name. The brothers' popularity peaked in 1965 when they were interviewed on national television. Everyone in Britain knew that the Kray brothers were playing with fire. Everyone knew they were the kings of London's criminal underworld, but at the same time, they were admired, imitated, and everyone wanted to be friends with them. The street gangs carefully copied the brothers' style, trying to look like them. But as it turned out, the end of the whole empire was near.